maybe you could tell me, how was it that you came to put these three pieces together for Truth Be Told? Because obviously there are more accounts, lived accounts, but you chose three strategically, I thought, that blended well. How did you do that?
Yeah, I think during the spring and summer of 2020, like many others in this nation, but also around the world, I was really sort of grappling with the issues surrounding Black life in America,
Mhm.
and more specifically, what activism meant or means with respect to protecting Black life. And of course, I was consumed with sort of this 21st century moment and the images on
Mm.
television and my phone and my iPad, and watching hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets, not just in the United States, but around the
The
globe,
one, yeah.
all over this issue of the way
Mm.
in which Black life isn't valued or isn't protected. And of course, these are issues that have lived as long as this has been a country and before, right? So if we think about
Yeah.
the history of people of African descent who
Mm.
walk what we call North America,
Right.
there's always been this conversation, this inequity, this tension, this violence connected to Black life. And as a scholar, I'm privileged to spend
Mm.
my days sort of reading and writing about Black women in particular, enslaved
Mm.
and free. But I was thinking so much about the activism that I was seeing in front of me,
Mm.
and thinking about the sort of foremothers, the women who foregrounded this kind of activism in different ways. And so for me, bringing together Harriet Jacobs, Susie King Taylor, and Ida B. Wells was a way for me to take three women, all of
Mm.
whom were born enslaved,
Mm.
and to look at the ways in which each of them were activists
Mm.
engaged in and fighting for Black life. And this, of course, is in the 19th century. So if we think about Harriet Jacobs, who was very involved in abolition, but was, when we think about her escape, her sort of prolonged attempt to remain detached, to become free, we have to look at that as a form of activism, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When we think about Susie King Taylor, this teenager who runs to Union lines
Mm.
in South Carolina and Georgia to assist in the Civil War as a nurse, as a teacher, that is
Yeah.
a form of activism. And then, of
Oh,
course, Ida B. Wells, who, you know, when you say activism in the 19th century, you can't not say her name.
that's what comes to mind. The irony, of course, is about 2 weeks ago, I was talking to my son on Facebook, not Facebook, FaceTime. Um, he had just read, he was just writing the responses to this exact piece of work that they were reading at college.
Mhm.
Um, of course, I wish I had known and I'd given him the audio version, but but it is such an important thing that you've done because it ties the past to the present, and people don't like to go back too far in the past. It's just so uncomfortable, but it's so necessary. It's
And what's so
necessary to understand the
it,
present.
it is, and what's so funny about your statement is that you're right. People don't like to go back in time, and historians typically don't want to go, too close to the present. We like to live with, dead folks. We deal with that, but I believe firmly that in order to understand your present and perhaps impact the future, you got to know the past. And
Mhm.
what I
Yeah.
tried to do in the essays that I wrote around the narratives, the
Mhm.
conclusions for each of these narratives, I
Mhm.
purposefully connected their experiences to a current day problem or issue. So if we're thinking
Mhm.
about fugitivity, if we're thinking about Harriet Jacobs running from a sexually exploitive, abusive
Mm.
enslaver, and what it means to live in the shadows. Well, there's a way to understand that experience when we think about those who are living in this nation as undocumented, right?
Yeah.
And so to remind people that, yeah, it's the past, but there are some very real baked in practices that we still see
Yeah.
in rotation today.
Yeah. The exploitation of women sexually when they don't have the power to resist that, when their
Exactly.
livelihood is literally hanging by a thread, or their freedom. I get you.
Exactly.
I felt like I had to listen to the voice in each one of those pieces and find their uniqueness. Um, and even though they are unique, I did sense that there was a connection, and I think you just nailed that what it is. And I hadn't actually thought about it, but they're all activists. They've chosen to speak. They've chosen to write down their experience and say, this is the truth. Truth be
Exactly.
told. Truth be told.
Told. And to write, I mean, just the when we think about the history of anti-literacy laws for
Mm.
enslaved people, right? These, as I said, these are all three women who were born enslaved. Ida B. Wells born much later than the others, but still, the
So,
actual act of memorializing your experiences in writing and
mhm.
then to publish them, you know, whether it was Harriet Jacobs publishing hers around the time of the beginning of the war, or Susie King Taylor doing it at the sort of beginning, towards the beginning of the 20th century, at the sort of nadir in race relations,
Right.
the sort of full, we see the full teeth of segregation at that moment.
Mm.
Or someone like Ida B. Wells, whose story is first, whose Southern Horrors is first published in T. Thomas Fortune's New York Age newspaper, you know.
Newspaper, right.
So that to me, that is activism. When we think about journalists today, we definitely
Yeah.
see folks who are activists, but the actual act of telling one story, standing behind it as a woman, as a Black woman, for all to read,
Hmm.
that's courage. That's
That's
activism.
courage. Yeah. Do you know if in any one of the cases or all three, when they attempted to publish their work, if there was doubt as to validity, was there difficulty getting it literally in the press? I'm assuming there is, but I would ask. Do you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. We, you know, definitely with Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl, her narrative was questioned up and down, left and right. It was, and we find this in the case of many of the narratives
Mm.
that were written by enslaved people.
Yeah.
You know, was this really written by her editor?
Right.
Was this really written by a white abolitionist who wanted to move this forward?
I noticed that it kept pinging in my mind that as far back as, oh gosh, now I'm going to forget her name because it's right on the tip of my tongue and I was about to speak it. First Black published female poet,
Um,
Massachusetts, you know what I'm
yeah,
talking about. Phyllis Wheatley. When Phyllis Wheatley, I've read her two biographies of hers. One that was a young adult. It was really very well put together, but it talked about the period during which she wanted to publish her collection. And she first it was doubted whether she could possibly have written these. And it took oh Lord, it took I would say not a council, but a uh, three white men combing over her work and interviewing her relentlessly before they could put their stamp of, no, we think she wrote this. And then she had to have it published in England because she couldn't get it published here. There was just so much doubt as to the validity of whether or not she wrote it.
And that has everything to do with white supremacy and it seeding doubt in educational possibilities or attainment or just
intellect, just capable intellect. I know, it's just crazy. I just finished, day before yesterday, the memoir of Katherine Johnson from Hidden Figures. And I'd known a lot about her because I'd narrated Hidden Figures. And I had gotten an early copy of the script, and then it went through so many script revisions. So I was like combing through all the material. And now I have just finished her memoir. But that same feature just keeps repeating, the doubt that this person could ever do it. And I don't usually think of that as a feature of a science like math that's so hard. Math is either right or it's wrong. There's no, it's part right. It's right or it's wrong. And so you almost cannot argue with the results. Yet and still, results were argued about, were debated. And it requires white people to come in and say, no, I say, this is real. Still to this day.
A patron, someone who supports, when we think specifically about writers, whether it's a Wheatley or a Jacobs, the reality was in the 19th century, and one could argue perhaps even still today, that we'd probably call them allies, right, today. But in the 19th century, you did have to have that kind of good housekeeping stamp of approval from a white patron, a man was best.
Usually better, who's best,
right? Or at least a white woman to certify and legitimize the writing that someone like a Jacobs, like a Susie King Taylor, or even an Ida B. Wells, that they completed. And it's like you said, it is almost unbelievable that we're still dealing with some of the same concerns today.
Yeah, it sneaks across lines too, because it's very evident in the writing, because we have this account of it. But the other idea of, if a woman owned a business, she couldn't negotiate with whites on her own. She needed an intermediary, and that intermediary needed to be white and male so they could do business. And I mean, that's in doing business. I had to bring this into class a couple of weeks ago. There were 3 very recent accounts of Black or mixed race families, like white husband and Black wife kind of thing, where they're trying to sell their house. And so they're showing the house with the real estate agent, and there are pictures of Black family members on the wall. And the appraisal was clearly low, to the tune of $125,000 to $175,000 less. So they took the house off the market after it was appraised very lowly, took all the photographs of the Black house, of the Black family members out of the house, plus any African art out of the house, put it back on the market, and the price went right up. Right up. So these legitimizing and delegitimizing experiences, I would assert, could be found in every sector if we looked. If we looked.
Agreed. And I think that, the lives of these women in the 19th century, they're portals into their experiences. And I don't want to, as a historian, it would be malpractice for me to say the 19th century was just the same as the 20th and the 21st century. No, things were very different in the 19th century in material ways, in legal ways. But ultimately, I think what you just said is a sort of reminder when we read these narratives, we can trace the kind of lineage of
Yeah.
inequity, and we can
Yeah.
see where and how they still reside in our nation.
Yeah. In doing my research on the race massacres, the decimation of towns or townships that were overwhelmingly predominantly Black or exclusively Black, where you had a great deal of people entering the middle class because they were successful at the thing they did and they patronized each other's businesses, and then having them decimated. I mean, if we were going to talk about reparations, I'd want to start there, because there's a record of who held property. There's a record of what was lost. And at the very least, the value of that property that was confiscated should easily be returnable to that family and its descendants.
Yes.
That's not tough. I mean, it seems to me like that. If we are talking about reparations all over the world, and we're talking about returning Nazi art, art confiscated, by Nazis. If we're talking about those returning things to Egypt from the pyramids that were plundered, then that should be part of the conversation, because there's a record of it. And those pieces of property still stand there. And yeah, you're going to have a little conflict because maybe somebody's living on it now, but they're living on it. There's going to be a lot of conflict. But if you're going to seek justice, if you're going to even have a semblance of justice, at the very least, we should be doing that.
Yes.
And I don't stand to gain anything. I do not. But all of that equity that could have been building up for that family and creating stability and access to better jobs, better neighborhoods, better education at the center of it, gone, just gone.
And the term you use, justice, it brings me back to these three women again, and thinking about their lives and their writing as a form of justice, right? That their friends and family and millions of people would never have their names spoken, would never know what kinds of degradation and trauma that they experience. We'll never know, right?
We'll never know. Right.
But these women, whether it's Susie King Taylor, Harriet Jacobs, or Ida B. Wells, they're telling their stories in many ways on behalf of all of the Black women who came before them, right? Who didn't have the opportunity to write for T. Thomas Fortune's newspaper, or to have their narrative published for a wide audience. That by knowing their names, saying their names, right? And by them telling the truth, we have their stories, but we got to see it as something bigger than that. And it's three classic narratives, because in many ways, the lives that they lived connected to the lives of millions of other formerly enslaved or enslaved women. And for that reason, once again, their work is activist work.
Their voice was one of the things that I felt I really needed to get right. And I could only take it from what was on the page. I can't interview them. And actually, let me ask this question first. Did you always hear this as an audiobook, as it being sound, or did you feel that it was more rightly something that should be read with our eyes or experienced with our ears?
I won't say I was conflicted. I think what's typical, as a professor, I'm used to assigning texts, right, that are written, that students can read and take notes in. But I will say that, living through the past year, 2020, and the pandemic, and teaching online, and doing sort of everything in a very digital way,
Mhm.
whether it's online virtual classrooms or most of our texts were all digital texts. I
Right.
wanted to give readers the opportunity to rest their eyes.
I find that fascinating. I've been doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I even put my first 3 lectures, I recorded them in my booth for so they could be used asynchronously. But
Mm,
I've been looking, I try to pair um, scholarly writing with lived experience. And
yep.
so lived experience comes to me a lot in the form of TED Talk or YouTube, somebody literally talking about what they know, who they are,
Mhm.
what their experience is, especially in the Native American chapter that I teach. 2 really great, one artist, one scholar comes on and talks about what it means to be Native American in this country and the erasure that goes on, so
Mhm.
that there's a personal connection to it. I think that was something that, I'm trying to remember if it was Danielle Allen who I first read that. Who was it? I'm trying to remember. There's a Black feminist writer from England, I think, Mina Salahi.
Mhm.
She talked about constantly combining. And I just leapt on that and I went, yes, she's right. It kind of struck me that
And
way.
I agree. I agree. I
Yeah.
do think that I also, I'm very people learn differently.
Hmm.
And I wanted to create something that was audio based for those who learn better when they listen. But I
Yeah.
also think it's a different process. There's an intimacy that
Yes.
one feels when they hear a story, when they hear someone, if you're walking with Truth Be Told, and you're listening
Mm.
to you beautifully narrate these women's lives, that's a completely different intellectual experience,
Mm.
perhaps spiritual experience, that happens in a way that you don't quite you can't replicate when you're reading from the
When you're reading the text, I would definitely agree with that. I know I feel that in my body because when I approached something like this in particular, lived experience, people's testimonies, I just kind of throw open the doors
Mhm.
and let myself feel what they're feeling. And what I encountered was Ida B. Wells is weary of constantly having to put this in front of people. So there's this fight in her to stay on target, stay on target, stay on target, um, because it's an incredibly emotional thing to speak about, devastatingly emotional. Um, and it's different. Talking about incidents in the life of a slave girl, there's some very emotional things that happen, but it almost feels like she keeps it in this place where I don't want to prejudice you, but you should read this and see what I have to say.
Mhm.
Almost like she's trying not to, um, if she's inflammatory, if she's over emotional, she will then be doubted,
Mhm.
as happens with many women. If we're over emotional, then what we're saying is just overblown.
Right.
It's hysteria. And in the case of the third piece, I forget who's the third one.
Ida's third, Susie King Taylor second, and Harriet is first. Harriet Jacobs is first.
So I guess it's Harriet Jacobs, who was in the, embedded with the Black unit. I related to her so strongly because we just lost my aunt, Irma Dryden, who was a nurse in the Tuskegee Air Corps.
Oh,
And I
so
had been put it,
her story, Susie King Taylor's story resonated with you then.
yes. Oh my gosh, yes. And how she needed to lay out the pictures for you. But again, she had that military discipline.
Yeah.
She had a kind of discipline in her storytelling. And it didn't loosen up until she had sort of gotten about 2/3 the way through. Then emotionally, I think it starts to
Mhm.
um, loosen a little bit, and you hear
Mhm.
her exasperation with it. But she doesn't really lose her hope for the future,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know. And so I was looking for what are the things that make each one of them unique, and just let that play.
Mhm.
Um, but
Mhm.
Ida B. Wells, I mean, trying to keep that in control, because again, you can't be a woman and get overly emotional,
Right.
or else you're undercut. It just undercuts you. And same thing, African American, and then you put the two together, so she, and then, I try and use a type of speech that has different vowels, ones that would have been used, I know for sure, during, like, say, the 1930s or 40s, because I have access to radio.
Right.
Before, our American speech sort of became this very loose and it was sloppy and form of speech where we condense everything. I love Trevor Noah's "Nah mean," know what I mean becomes "nah mean." We do that so often.
Right.
But giving the full weight even just to the word interesting instead of interesting, or different would have been more of that time period. So I tried to keep the vowels and keep the compression to a minimum. So
can I jump in and ask a question? Because
sure.
what you're saying, I think people want to know your process, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what drew you to narrating, period. Like how did you get here?
Well,
Here's the thing. We all know you. We know your voice. You've won these incredible awards. Bravo. But
you.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey and how you arrived here.
Well, I'm not sure whether I should attribute it to, I wanted to do community service because I grew up in a family where we were always doing something. My parents would take the dining room table and they would take young students of color, their resumes, and cut them up and reword them. And then my mother would give them to her secretary and they type up a decent resume for them to apply for jobs. So they were always doing that. My dad worked for the NAACP and the National Urban League, La Raza as well, all organizations that were trying to promote more employment within communities of color. I lived with my grandparents, and my grandfather was about 86 years old and visiting shut-ins, his age and sometimes younger, in the nursing homes in town, in our little New Jersey town. And I'd go with him. And at one point, I was the president of the chorus, and we would bring the chorus and we'd go to their day room and we'd sing for them. And so it was just so much a part, it was kind of baked in. And I graduated, I guess it was from Yale Drama School, or maybe it was Yale undergrad, one of those two places, and came to New York and went, oh, this feels weird. I don't have a community, I don't have a way to give back. I don't have a service. And I thought, well, gosh, I'm an actor. What can I do for anybody? Nobody needs anything I got to do. And then a little voice in my head, one day when I was having my hair done, I came out and I looked across the street, and there were the letters for Lighthouse for the Blind. And I went, oh, that's what I could do. I could read for the blind. That's something an actor could do. So I got home, I opened up the Yellow Pages. I called American Foundation for the Blind. And don't you know, I inquired, and they said, oh, let us give you to the Talking Book Studios. And when I got through, they heard my voice on the phone. They said, why don't you come in for an audition? Which is now a lot more difficult to just walk into a job. But at the time, I was the youngest thing going, because everybody else was an older, mature actor with some cred under their cred under their feet. I don't know, some experience. I came in, I auditioned, I was rejected. And they said, well, we know why, because our client likes things done ABC. Let us coach you into it and have you come back in 6 months. So I did. And they told me what style to go for, and I auditioned and I got it. And then I was auditioned again and I was cleared for fiction, then nonfiction, and then poetry. They actually had a separate category for poetry. And my grandfather happened to be a professor of Victorian poetry and Shakespeare. I grew up with that stuff. Like, he wasn't reading me Charlotte's Web. He was reading me curfew shall not ring tonight, and he shall die by the wine cup in his hand, long poems. And he would actually memorize from the Odyssey passages 15 minutes long, because in Jamaican system of education, very British, part of what you did was memorization and oral interp. So we had that at home. So I was looking for community service. I got the gig, and as I was speaking to him on the phone about scheduling and when can you come, And they said, and it pays. And I said, oh, it pays? I thought I was volunteering. And they said, oh, no, dear, this is an after job. And I thought, whoopee, wow. And I had just, I think I just graduated from undergrad. And I had very, luckily, very quickly I booked a commercial, and I booked a musical, and I booked another thing. And so I had all my union cards. And that was kind of how I started. And then one of my colleagues, the wonderful Suzanne Torin, who I hope will be directing me on one of my titles in a few weeks, she suggested that I audition for Recorded Books and put us in touch. And I did, and they gave me my first book. It went well. Then and it was a multicast, so there were 4 different people on it. And then they went, okay, she did okay. Let's give her a book on her own. And that one won me my first earphone award. And I guess they went, okay, we'll stick with this one. And that was kind of how it started.
And the rest is history, right? Here you are. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you prepare before you narrate. And I'm thinking, specifically with something like Truth Be Told, where there's very kind of difficult subject matter to engage. Maybe tell us what your secret, if maybe not secret, your methodology is behind
my
preparation.
My secret spice. I read it as well as I can. For short pieces like this, uninterrupted, I just try and read it and absorb it. And I usually have a pen or pencil in hand, and I'm marking where particularly long thoughts are building, just so that, there's really no rehearsal with audiobooks. They're just too long. So you have to rely on your instincts. Yeah. You've got to just stay open and let your instincts register what you just read and how it felt as you walk in this person's shoes. And usually I just open my mouth and I start reading. I'll read the first few pages and I'll go, okay. And then I go back and I start reading the first few pages again, now aloud, and see just what does my mouth want to do? What does my voice want to do? Because I'm not going to tell it. I'm going to see what it wants to do. So that's first. And like I said, with all 3 of these pieces, I could detect there was a uniqueness in each one. It was different. And I generally try not to question that. I recently read, the title of it is, it's Cicely Tyson's memoir. Just recently, it came out when did it come out?
Very recently, like last
month
or something.
Couple months ago, right? Just before she passed.
Yeah.
And I got to speak to her in person. Not in person, I mean on Zoom, but you know what I mean, like voice to voice, not typed, voice to voice. She's like one of the biggest reasons I went into this business. I believed that I could be an actress because she was an actress. And she was Black and she was female. She had an overbite. I had an overbite. I was like, yay, good on you, and she was so truthful. And it was interesting when I first started reading the book, I spent a few hours watching interviews with her from when she was like 26 all the way up until in her 90s. So I was Googling and looking for interviews. And I saw that particularly in her later years, she was a master of the pause, and she took her time. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a challenge because there's always this. So there is an outside pressure that's a technical pressure not to read too slowly. And one reason is the ear is not taking in all the information visually. It's literally just getting it this way. And you can kind of hear faster. So that's one thing. And I was running the risk of possibly going too slowly and boring. You know what I mean? I was afraid of that. So I just kind of gave it a faster clip. And I know from hearing feedback from some of my books, on Audible in the feedback area kind of thing. With young adult pieces, I was getting, oh my God, she's so slow. Because teenagers are going at this clip.
Yes, they are.
They're not going at an old speed. So I immediately started to make an adjustment. to how I read.
Mhm.
And when I read news, even I read for Apple News Plus, and I read for Curio, the British publisher, and they both want more contemporary speech, faster thoughts, just more like speech, a little rougher, not so perfect on the consonants and things.
Mhm.
So I've been making that adjustment, and I've been doing that over the course of a few years, especially anything in the YA market. And so she heard it and she said, "Oh no, honey, you need to slow down."
I love it.
And I went back and she said, "Oh girl, always trust your instincts.
Mm.
Your instincts will always do you well." And I thought, from the master, I
Mm.
will take it. I will take it. And I redid that.
Mm.
So tempo is something that I like to listen to and glean and feel. And then there's always that little voice in the back going, "Yeah, but if I do it too slowly, I might lose the younger demographic." Um, it's that's a difficult thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Realizing that you also are responsible to your audience, and how do you best reach them? What's the demographic going to be? That's hard.
Yeah. Tell me what your thoughts are about the power of storytelling. And I'm thinking
Mm.
the power of storytelling, but also, with a special nod to today, to this moment.
Oh,
Tell me
I
your
think
thoughts.
I think we're coming full circle to literally how we come out of our mother's wombs. We are born wired for narrative. We're born wired for story. We are not wired to read. That is
Mm.
a complicated process of creating neurological connections between two parts of our brain that are not connected. But speech and storytelling, every country, every culture around the globe has a storyteller from the earliest points, somebody who usually has a pretty high profile too in terms of status,
Mhm.
to be the keeper of stories, the origin story of that culture. The whole idea of coming around the campfire, after you've slain the food source, then you're around the fireplace. There was storytelling.
Mhm.
And we've gone on this very complicated journey where things were always oral, and then they became written down, and then they were oral again on radio, and then they became wedded with the visual because of television and movies both. And now we've kind of come, I think, full circle back to podcasts.
Mm.
I think, and we keep returning to it because it is primarily an oral art, and
Mhm.
using your voice to create the structure, to undergird the structure of the story. I am hearing stylistically and genre wise a difference. My younger students, when they want to do audiobooks, say, they go into audiobooks and they want to keep everything really cool and dispassionate and disconnected. Um, and there's a place for that. If that's who your character is,
Sure.
sure. First person, sure. But a lot of it's I don't want to seem like I'm putting too much effort into it because like that's like it's over the top stack. It's very fast. But what I try and impress upon them is, well, that's great for short exchanges and TV where scenes are small. But you know what? Average audiobook is 8 to longer side, maybe 12 hours.
Yep.
I can't listen to 12 hours of toss off, toss off, toss. I can't listen to 8 hours of that. I'd be like on my phone, which
Yeah.
is actually part of the process, and learning how actually to give over to your ears
Mm.
is a process. It's a process. It's a
Mhm.
process, and getting really the richness out of it. But I think this last award for the city we became, the writing is terrific, and I know that we brought it up into an audio realm notch up, which it should. If it goes to audio, it should go a notch up,
Mhm.
or two or three.
Mhm.
Um, but you have to completely kind of give over to what it demands of you vocally
Mhm.
and orally. Um, my students in my script analysis class are doing an audio drama of their final scenes because last year when we pivoted, We were just beginning to start those scenes.
Mm.
And then we were not in the classroom anymore. And how were they going to perform them? And so I was like, I know, audio drama. And I talked to them about how to record each other remotely so that their performance is in sync and captured on two ends. And then they put it in something simple like GarageBand. And then they can add another track for sound effects that help to ground us in a location. You know, so my students are doing a scene from Sweat. It takes place in a bar. So I saved up over a month of wine glasses or not wine glasses, but beer bottles and wine bottles, and started making the sounds of bottles being washed out and cleared, and somebody picking up three beer bottles and taking them off, and then just making a little under track of that. I recorded about a 1.5-minute loop of birdsong from my New York City Harlem fire escape. Things like that, traffic noises. What do you need to give a sense of place, so it's not just a voices in a box? What's necessary for the narrative to work in a vocal landscape became the challenge. And they got so much out of it that I decided, okay, done. This is what we do from now on. Oh my goodness, done. And then I made a little how-to tape and I shared it with all my colleagues across the country. I was like, guys, this is great, you know, because everybody had the rug pulled out from under them. We were all trying to figure out how do we serve our students? How do we keep the rug from being pulled out anymore from under their feet? And that was the way to do it, was to pivot to audio drama. So
well,
I'm always sneaking a little bit.
I'm going to take I'm going to borrow your methodology and your assignments, because what a sort of important kind of assignment. And I love what you said originally about sort of reading being something that is not, that's actually not, we're not hardwired to do, that it's
some of us don't get wired either. If you're dyslexic, you're not going to wire completely to that left brain.
Right. And to be able to engage in storytelling, as you've put it, something that all of us everywhere appreciate, and to bring these women's lives to people's ears, to know that people will listen to Ida B. Wells, they will listen to Susie King Taylor, they will listen to Harriet Jacobs. They will know their stories by listening to Truth Be Told. I'm super grateful. And so I want to thank you for working on this, and for lending your voice to their words. And I'm also just really grateful that we got to spend this time together.
I know, this was fun. This was so much fun. My sister girl network has been growing.
Let it keep growing. Let it keep growing. And so I will.
No, I was just gonna say, I remembered this was a few years ago now, because I direct and produce as well, and we were doing the Lincoln Douglas debates. And so it was Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debating, and they had all the transcripts of those debates, and they were like 90 minutes long, and they were in several different locations. And so what I remembered, I was not part of the post-production team. My job was to direct, actually co-direct. I had, it was Richard Dreyfuss, who I directed for a day, and David Strathairn. And David Strathairn. So he was basically playing Lincoln, and that was my directing job. And there was another director that was basically sort of directing Lincoln, because we were on opposite coasts. Stephen Douglas were opposite coasts. But what I remembered, it was up for a Grammy. And when I started to listen to it, I went, what a brilliant idea. So they recreated the ambient sounds of these two men standing in front of a crowd of people debating. And in the text, it was like, the crowd laughs. So they put in the crowd laughter, which was really helpful, because the language was so archaic from that time period. Just the structure of English itself and the usage was so archaic that there were times when Lincoln or Douglas would say something, and the crowd would laugh, and we go, okay, he made a joke. What was the joke? What's the joke? And we had to kind of figure out why it was funny. But we knew that the laughter was there. So we had missed something, which was a great guideline to doing that. But the idea of adding that ambient sound, oh my gosh, that for me was the first time I went, ooh, why don't we do that all the time? Why don't we do that more often? You know? So I try and integrate that now. Did we win the Grammy? No, I don't think we did. No, we were finalists. We were just finalists, but
That's important.
yeah, it was an honor. Just had the same thing with Charlotte's Web. I was on that with it was Meryl Streep and a full cast of us playing the animals. And again, it's just an honor. It's just such an honor to be there, you know, saying, yeah, I was part of that. That's great. So cool.
Well, it's an honor to be anywhere with you. So I want to thank you
Thank
for
you.
spending
Likewise.
time. Thank you. So I'm
Likewise.
just a bit of a fangirl. So thank you for agreeing to have the conversation with me. And I think that's it.